Hey everyone, probably much to your relief, this is the last of our PowerPoints on our topic this week, the Nixon administration and its handling of the Vietnam War, appropriately titled The End. I want to just touch on a few significant aspects of actions that the Nixon administration takes in this final period, and then make a few comments about the Paris Peace Accords, the agreement that ends direct American military involvement in Vietnam, and then a few quick thoughts about what happens to South Vietnam in the aftermath. So let's get started. By 1972, Nixon's Vietnam policy was really in tatters. Remember what we've covered to this point, what I've talked about, what you've read about in Olson and Roberts. Here's a president who came in vowing to extricate the United States from the war. And as I've explained, and you've read in the Olson and Roberts book, Nixon and Kissinger were in agreement about that goal, but they were fixated on the idea of reaching some sort of resolution that didn't look like a defeat. And so what you get is what I, as a historian, describe as really a slow motion defeat that extends tragically over several more years. And throughout this period that we've covered this week, remember, negotiations were still going on. These had started in 1968 when Lyndon Johnson was president. Negotiations between the American delegation, North Vietnamese delegates, and representatives of the Viet Cong. And Nixon and Kissinger had permanently relocated these to Paris, but they've been going on for years and had remained stalemated. 1972 was an election year for Richard Nixon. He was hoping to have some sort of dramatic announcement of having reached a resolution about American involvement in Vietnam prior to the election. That didn't happen. And by this time, public support for the war is really non-existent. Congress has revoked the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, the legal basis for the entire war, and is threatening to revoke funding completely. So in a final sort of desperate gambit, Nixon, in an attempt to break the stalemated negotiations, orders massive bombing of North Vietnam after there had been an extended bombing halt. This became known as the Christmas bombing because this happens before and around and after Christmas 1972, and this was done deliberately when college students were on break. And over this period, the United States drops greater tonnage of bombs than it had dropped previous 2 years. At the time and later, Nixon credited this kind of final spasm of violence with being the act that brought the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong to a resolution of the conflict. I would argue that this bombing also forced the United States to reach a final agreement because this bombing was condemned by every country in the world. Even America's primary allies and staunchest supporters condemned this last act of violence. So just about a month later, the United States, the North Vietnamese, and Viet Cong delegations reach what becomes known as the Paris Accord, sometimes called the Paris Peace Accords, too, a general agreement ending the American role in the conflict. You see here in the photograph Henry Kissinger with the very tough, skilled North Vietnamese negotiator Le Duc Tho. The terms of this agreement were not popular with the South Vietnamese government. I'm going to talk about why that was in the next couple slides. And in fact, Richard Nixon threatened to cut off all economic and military aid to South Vietnam if they didn't go along with the terms of the Paris Peace Accords, which the South Vietnamese government did, but with great reluctance. So, what had the United States and the communist negotiators been arguing about for all these years? Well, one of the main issues for the Americans had been a demand that the boundary between North and South Vietnam be regarded as a permanent one. And in the end, the United States dropped this demand and agreed that the boundary would be temporary or provisional, as they say here on the slide, the term the agreement itself used. So this is one of the major points that have been argued for years, and ultimately the United States drops this demand. Another key element in the Paris Peace Accords was that North Vietnamese military forces were allowed to remain in South Vietnam. Again, this issue had been argued over for years. The American negotiating position from the beginning had been that when American troops withdrew, North Vietnamese forces had to withdraw as well and return to North Vietnam. And in the end, the United States dropped this condition as well. So this is one of the points that was particularly objectionable to the South Vietnamese government because it allowed North Vietnamese forces to remain throughout the country, which obviously decreased the chances of South Vietnam being able to survive as an independent entity. Other major terms: American prisoners of war were released. The only concession really that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong made regarded Viet Cong representation in the South Vietnamese government. The Viet Cong had demanded the formation of a coalition government in South Vietnam in which they would have a significant role. And in the end, they compromised and dropped this demand, but it was really the only one of theirs that they weren't able to secure. So in the period of arguing over these terms, 25,000 more Americans died. In fact, more Americans were killed during the Nixon years of withdrawing from Vietnam than the Kennedy-Johnson years combined. And hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese died in these years too as these negotiations dragged on. I would argue these are terms the United States could have had back in 1969 had we been willing to accept them. But Nixon's stubborn insistence on trying to attain what he misleadingly termed peace with honor, which is what he termed this settlement, which complete joke. That insistence on trying to reach that objective resulted in the war dragging out 5 more years, many people being killed, and an agreement that was nowhere close to the phrase peace with honor. The most important thing for the American public, I think, was simply overwhelming relief, as they say here on the slide, that this damn war was over and that Americans that had been held prisoner were coming home and that direct American involvement had come to an end. So what happened to South Vietnam? Well, the war in Vietnam continued in the aftermath of the American departure. We know now that there was a split of opinion between Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. Nixon really clung to the idea of preserving an independent South Vietnam. He believed that was important. Kissinger recognized that the survival of South Vietnam was very unlikely. And in private conversations, he used this expression, a decent interval. He wanted a decent interval between the announcement of the Paris Accords and then what he believed would ultimately be the final collapse of South Vietnam. That collapse comes 2 years later in 1975, when this final chaotic episode that you read about in the Olson and Roberts book, thousands of South Vietnamese are trying to flee the country and the communist takeover, particularly those, and there were tens of thousands of South Vietnamese who had worked in some capacity for the U.S. government, feared retribution, and there were these last desperate attempts to evacuate people down to people filing into helicopters from the roof of the American embassy in Saigon. President Gerald Ford raised the idea of American troops possibly going back in, and there was absolute resistance to that from Congress, from the Senate, no support from the American public, and Ford dropped the idea. And of course, Nixon's out of the picture because he had resigned a year earlier. So this tragic conclusion in many ways was a fitting one to a war that Nixon had dragged out unnecessarily, I would argue, for 5 additional years. Again, as I said earlier in this presentation, these were terms we could have had in 1969 had we been willing to make the concessions that we did late 1972, early 1973. It's absolutely ghastly and senseless that this war extended under Nixon as long as it did. Next week, we'll be talking about Layli Haislip's book, When Heaven and Earth Change Places. A couple weeks from now, we'll come back to the aftermath of the Vietnam War and how it directly impacted Nixon and his administration and contributed directly to his political downfall. And we'll also start to look at how Americans began to process the war even in the 1970s.